Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to Bhagavad Gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana Das, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you, an honor to have you here with me. Thank you all very much, those of you who are joining me live this evening. And if you would be good enough to click on the little raise your hand button so that I know you can hear me, that would be wonderful. Thank you all very, very much. All right. Now that I know that I can be heard, let's go to our usual little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who are new to the satsang and joining me live this evening, you can adjust your audio settings and your viewing options in the upper right-hand corner. You need not worry about your microphone or camera. I cannot see or hear you, but if you would like to be heard, please type a question or a comment into the chat. You can also use the Q&A if you prefer. I have both windows open, and I will see anything that you put in either of them. Technical adjustment. And that takes care of that. Our last class, we began chapter 18, Arjuna's questions, or I should say question, about renunciation. Now, fine-tuning his understanding with a faith-based question about the distinction between different kinds of renunciation. We heard from Krishna about 3 activities that no one should renounce, and we covered verses 1 through 6. This evening, we are going to hear Krishna summarize his teachings about karma. And what's interesting about this is how he's packed his teachings about karma into the expansion of his explanation about the nature of renunciation. So we'll see how karma and renunciation go hand in hand. We will also hear how there is no way to delay that trouble coming every day, and the impossibility of inactivity. We will cover verses 7 through 12, but before we do that, as is our usual practice, we will chant our invocation mantra. So for those of you who are new to transliterated Sanskrit, Sanskrit rendered in the Roman alphabet with diacritics, marks that give us pronunciation cues. The dot over an M indicates that we close our lips together in front. At the same time, we close the back of our tongue to the back of the roof of our mouth, so that the sound comes sort of out of our jaw and out of our nose as much as out from between our lips. A bar over a vowel, in this case an A, indicates an elongated and open version of that vowel, ah, as opposed to a short and more contained version of the vowel, which we would pronounce when there is no bar. And with that information, I will chant this mantra, and if you like, you can chant it back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Translation: I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, Krishna, who is the all-pervading transcendence. So, picking up where we left off last week, Arjuna said in verse number 1, O mighty armed one, I wish to know the truth about the distinction between the renunciation of action and the renunciation of the fruits of action. O slayer of Keshi, master of the senses. So this is actually a really good question. Throughout the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna has spoken about renunciation and describe different levels of karma and karma yoga. And here in Krishna's reply and his elaboration, the verses we'll get into this evening, we hear how these two things go together. And as I mentioned last week, the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is kind of a review of the whole Gita. The setup is in chapter 1, the preview is in chapter 2, chapters 3 through 17 constitute the essential teachings of the Gita. And now, observing Murrow's, or Edward R. Murrow's law of communication, Krishna is now telling Arjuna what he just told him. And so we're going back to the first portion of the Bhagavad Gita, the lessons, the instructions that we heard as early as the third chapter, when Krishna begins to speak about karma, karma yoga, and the relationship of karma and renunciation. So Krishna's reply, or he finishes his reply in verse number 6, all these activities, and here he's referring back to sacrifice, charity, and austerity, should certainly be performed, but without attachment, sannyasa, or any desire for a result, tyaga. O son of Prita, this is certainly my ultimate opinion. So again, we are hearing Krishna's opinion as opposed to a commandment. He's not telling Arjuna, you must do like this, but rather, here's what I think the distinction between these two different kinds of renunciation is, and the kinds of activities that you should engage in. So what's interesting here and important to understand is that renunciation doesn't mean giving up action. Renunciation means two different things. One, giving up attachment to the action, and giving up attachment to the results of the action. So we will look a little more closely at this in the verses coming up. So these two terms, sannyasa, meaning renunciation, and tyaga, also meaning renunciation. But sannyasa means renunciation of actions, and particularly actions born of material desires or material action. And tyaga, renunciation of the fruits of action. Now, this is a little different from the formal order of sannyas. So here we have a photo of a sannyasi. This is Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, who is my great-grandfather guru in my lineage. And you see that someone who is in the renounced order of life just wears very simple unsewn cloth and has renounced life in the material world. This is the fourth stage of life in the system of Varnashram Dharma. That is to say, the combination of 4 varnas, social positions, and 4 ashrams, or stages of life. So in the ideal prescription for a spiritual life from start to finish, the first 25 years or so of one's life is dedicated to learning. The second 25 years of one's life is dedicated to family life, development of a family, and economic development that goes with that. The third 25 years of one's life, retirement, winding down, empty nesting, letting go of material entanglements. And then the last stage, the last 25 years of life, the preparation for the next life by dying before you die, essentially. In India, when someone takes sannyas, they're legally dead. for all intents and purposes, they are no longer engaged in the material world, and everything they do is entirely, presumably, on the spiritual platform. However, Krishna has made it clear here that what he's talking about is not necessarily being in this kind of extraordinary level of material renunciation. He defines this differently in the first verse of the 6th chapter, which we see here, with the words sannyasi cha yogi cha emphasized for our reference. He equates being a renunciate with being a yogi. The translation, Blessed Lord said, one who performs their duty without attachment to the fruits of their actions is both a renunciate and a yogi, not one who lights no sacred fire, nor who abstains from sacrificial action. So, the bottom line here, we are engaged in renunciation of activities born of material desires when we undertake the process of yoga. And as such, we develop both kinds of renunciation. Renunciation from the activity itself, that is to say, to the degree that we become surrendered and detached from doing any particular kind of thing, to that extent, we are making progress on the path of yoga. Now, that detachment is not artificial, and I'll speak a little bit more about that as we look at tonight's verses. It is a natural development on the path of yoga. So I don't want you to worry that you're not practicing yoga if you have some attachment to some aspect of material life. That's not what I'm saying either. But it's a gradual, natural process of renunciation that comes with advancement on the path of yoga, which is to say we become interested in spiritual life, and to the degree that we gain a taste for spiritual life, our interest in material life naturally recedes. So it's not some artificial renunciation either. All right. If you have any questions about anything that I just spoke about in our review of last week's verses, please go ahead, pop them into the chat, or if you prefer, into the Q&A window, and I will get to your questions and comments. In the meantime, we will read through this week's verses. So as is our usual way of doing things, I'm going to read through the translation of each verse so we have a sense of the flow of this section. Then we'll go back and look at each verse individually, and I will do my best to provide some illuminating comments as I have heard and understood these verses from my teachers, and we will chant the Sanskrit for one of these verses. So here we go. Verse number 7. Prescribed action should not be renounced. Renunciation of such duties due to the influence of illusion is said to be renunciation in the mode of ignorance. Verse 8. One who abandons prescribed action on the basis of it being troublesome or due to fear of physical suffering renounces merely in the mode of passion. Thus, they never obtain the rewards of renunciation. Verse 9. O Arjuna, one who performs prescribed actions simply because they ought to be performed, renouncing all attachment to both the action and its fruits, is, in my opinion, acting in the mode of goodness. Verse 10. The intelligent renunciate, whose doubts have been severed, who is situated in the mode of goodness has neither an aversion to disagreeable actions nor any attachment to action that is agreeable. Verse 11, to abstain from action entirely is indisputably impossible for one who is embodied. One who renounces the fruits of action, however, is said to be a genuine renunciate. And verse 12, even after death, the threefold fruits of action, desirable, undesirable, and mixed, come to those who are not renounced. For those who are renounced, there are no such results at any time. So that takes us through our verses for this evening. So now we'll go back and take a look at each verse in some detail. So, verse number 7 again, prescribed action should not be renounced. Renunciation of such duties due to the influence of illusion is said to be renunciation in the mode of ignorance. So here in this cluster of verses, we have the return of the three qualities of material nature: ignorance, passion, and goodness. And the trajectory that we're going to see in this 18th chapter is that Krishna will establish once again that the path of yoga that he is advocating for Arjuna and by extension for us is meant to elevate us through these qualities of material nature from ignorance to passion to goodness. So once again, the qualities of material nature, also known as the gunas, are hierarchical. And the idea is to elevate one's consciousness to the mode of goodness, because the mode of goodness acts as a launching pad to transcendence. To the extent that we've still got ourselves invested in activities, habits that are influenced by the modes of passion and ignorance, to that extent, we are rowing a boat with our anchor still down in the water, and that makes it more difficult to go anywhere. So the elevation of consciousness through the modes to the mode of goodness and then beyond is what we're going to see. So Krishna here is going to be speaking about prescribed action. At least that's how it is translated. So let's take a look at prescribed by what? Who is the prescriber? What is the, where did this prescription come from? It is prescribed by scripture. Krishna will be referring to the Vedas, but we will find references to such duties perhaps in other scriptures. Yoga wisdom texts provide us with prescribed duties according to our social position and our natural aptitude due to our karma. In the course of making his practical and philosophical arguments in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna has been consistently referring to Arjuna's royal lineage. When he speaks of him, when he doesn't just say, "Oh Arjuna," he says, "Oh son of Kunti, oh Bharata." He constantly refers to Arjuna by names that indicate his royal heritage, his royal lineage, his martial talents: Mahabahu, mighty armed, slayer of enemies, scorcher of foes. So he's speaking about the nature of his birth and his natural aptitude for leadership, for heroism, for being a warrior. So Krishna is emphasizing that Arjuna's social duty to fight is not just some arbitrary assignment that he's been given. It's a function of his genetics and his fate, his karma. So Arjuna's dharma, his essential nature, is to be a warrior. Why? Well, because it's a function of his karma. He was born with these natural talents and born into a social situation where he has a duty to use those particular talents. So this reflects back on what I spoke about earlier, that we cultivate a sense of renunciation insofar as what kind of action we engage in, but that doesn't mean that we artificially engage in an action that we're not well suited for, or that we renounce an action that we are well suited for. So the Vedic social system, which is designed to give everyone in the society an opportunity to be elevated in their consciousness, to make progress in spiritual life, aligns people's social obligations with their natural inclinations. And Arjuna is naturally endowed with the essential qualities of a warrior, so his social obligation is aligned with those essential qualities. So the takeaway here is that dharma as a function of social duty does not exist in isolation from dharma as an expression of an essential nature. So these are two different definitions of dharma, social duty and essential nature, that are not mutually exclusive. They operate together, two sides of the same coin. And so too for us. We have an essential nature, we have a position in society, and we do our civic duty, but we do it in such a way as it doesn't, we don't allow it to entangle us. We don't identify with the qualities of material nature that make us a particular way in the material world. We simply leverage whatever our material situation is in terms of essential nature, the way we are and what we ought to be doing, in such a way so that it moves us and everyone we're in relationship with further along the path of spiritual life. So the detachment is to material life, and we cultivate this detachment through action rather than walking away from action altogether. Please pop any questions or comments you have in the chat. And as I wait for your comments or questions, let me move on to another part of this verse, which is Krishna said that renunciation of such duties due to the influence of illusion is said to be renunciation in the mode of ignorance. So what is Arjuna's illusion? Remember, Krishna's giving Arjuna an argument that is meant to convince him that he should fight. So as we come full circle, let's ask ourselves, what's the illusion that is influencing Arjuna such that he thinks he should renounce his prescribed duty of fighting? Remember, all the way back in the beginning, he decides, I don't want to fight. I should just walk away. Maybe I should go to the forest, live as a mendicant. I'd rather do anything than face this destiny that is being presented before me. So Arjuna's sentiments in this regard are based on illusion. And Krishna's presentation is meant to dispel Arjuna's illusion and ours. So Arjuna's first mistake, the first illusion that he's under, is that he is thinking the material body is the person. And if he kills someone on the battlefield, he's killing the person. He's mistaking the material body for the spiritual self. And therefore, Krishna begins with the distinction between spirit and matter in the second chapter, beginning with the 12th verse. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings assembled on the battlefield, nor in the future is there any possibility that any of us will cease to be. And he goes on to explain the distinction between the temporary material body that we inhabit and the eternal spiritual person that we are. Much like someone who acquires a set of clothing, wears it for some time, wears it out after some time, and then trades in the old clothing for a new set of clothing. Similarly, we move through our body, through time. The body wears out. We relinquish the body at the time of death. And for one who dies, birth is certain. For one who takes birth, death is also certain. And round it goes in the cycle of samsara, the repetition of birth and death in the material world. So that's Arjuna's illusion. He's thinking that this temporary material body is the person, the self. The second illusion is that he thinks himself to be the enjoyer of the fruits of his actions, which brings us to the next verse. In verse 8, Krishna says, one who abandons prescribed actions on the basis of it being troublesome or due to fear of physical suffering, renounces merely in the mode of passion, and thus they never obtain the rewards of renunciation. Well, the reward of renunciation is liberation, freedom from illusion, freedom from karmic reactions, freedom from the obligation to take on yet another material body. Beyond that, the reward, as we will see momentarily, is grace, the favor of the Supreme Person. Why that is will be explained momentarily. First, let's go back and look at Arjuna's reasons for not fighting. So all the way in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, in the first chapter, in the very beginning of the second chapter, Arjuna offers up 5 different reasons why he thinks it better not to fight. The first is compassion. That is to say, he doesn't want to kill anybody. He is concerned that he's going to kill people, and as we have discussed, the illusion is that he's mistaking the material body for the spiritual person. So he doesn't want to perform his prescribed duty for fear of physical suffering, not just for himself, but for others. In the next set of verses, he talks about how there will be no possibility of happiness if he is responsible for the deaths of his family members. So he's got his own brothers and family members on his side, and he has his cousins and other family members, his extended family, on the other side. And he speaks about how if they were dead, he wouldn't wish to live. There would be no enjoyment here. So again, the illusion that he's the enjoyer, that what he should be doing is somehow or other arranging things or acting in such a way as to bring about a happy ending, happily ever after. And this is also illusory, because in the material world, there is no happily ever after. And the pursuit of happiness based on material desires Krishna has spoken about now at length as being an exercise in futility, that there is such a thing as happiness, but Arjuna's standard for happiness is a mundane standard. And the actual happiness that is available to every person on the spiritual level is a whole different category of happiness. Now, it's totally natural for Arjuna and anyone else to want to be happy. The Vedanta Sutra speaks of the Supreme Person as naturally joyful. Anandamaya bhasat is the particular phrase. And because every one of us is an infinitesimal part of the infinite complete whole that is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, we also have this natural tendency, this natural inclination to seek pleasure, to enjoy happiness, to experience bliss. We're just looking for it in the wrong place. And Arjuna is looking for it in the wrong place, in that he's trying to unravel a very tangled up situation that can't really end any other way than badly, and turn it into a source of happiness. The next reason that Arjuna rationalizes as a reason for abandoning his prescribed duty of fighting is fear of bad karma. He's afraid that there will be a negative reaction to what he perceives as a sinful activity, namely killing people, but specifically killing family members, or killing his teacher, killing his grandfather, killing his seniors, that is to say, those who are worthy of his respect. Krishna has already made a case that these roles that family members play are temporary, and these particular family members have lost their qualification for being respected. But beyond that, Krishna has presented Arjuna with a way of acting that does not generate a reaction of any kind, good, bad, or indifferent, and that is the offering of one's actions to Vishnu, or the Supreme Person. And as we move a little deeper into the chapter, we will dig into the ethical controversy once again of how one justifies engaging in warfare, and whether or not it is possible to kill someone and have it not be a sinful activity. The word papebyo and similar words are generally translated as sinful. And in this case, in yoga, sinful means contrary to cosmic order, something that is disharmonious with the natural order of things. It's a little different than the Western religious conception of sin. But still, we understand that as a general rule, if anything is sinful, it's killing someone. At least unless you've got without a very good reason for doing so. The fourth reason for Arjuna wanting to abandon his duty is destruction of family traditions, or breakdown, social breakdown. And then finally, confusion. He doesn't know what to do. So he's going for an evasive maneuver, and it's just not working out. He has given all of these reasons: material compassion, the absence of enjoyment, fear of bad karma, destruction of social institutions, and finally just confusion. He just doesn't know what to do. And throughout the Gita, Krishna has given him reasons why each of these arguments really don't hold up. The destruction of the social institution can't happen in some respects because Krishna creates a particular kind of social order that persists irrespective of the recognition of this natural order of things in an institutional way. But even if it all falls apart, well, if that's the will of providence, then there's no way to delay that trouble coming every day. Things fall apart. And we can understand that since as they say, not a blade of grass moves without the sanction of the Lord, if it is Krishna's will that things fall apart, then things are going to fall apart. And Krishna has presented himself as time, the destroyer of all worlds. And he has come to destroy everyone on the battlefield except for Arjuna and his brothers. And there's nothing that Arjuna can do about it. You cannot stop time. And this particular season of time, Kali Yuga, is a time when things especially fall apart, where the lower modes of passion and ignorance become dominant, and the mode of goodness becomes the exception rather than the rule. Therefore, the process of yoga for this particular season of time is simplified for us in order to take into account the higher degree of difficulty of elevating one's consciousness from the lower modes that dominate the atmosphere in this particular season of time to the higher modes that we would like to get to. So, any questions about this, please let me know. Whoop, let's not jump ahead of ourselves here. We're only up to verse 9. So verse 9 once again. O Arjuna, one who performs prescribed actions simply because they ought to be performed, renouncing all attachment to both the action and its fruits, is, in my opinion, acting in the mode of goodness. So this is a reiteration of the last verse from last week, 18:6. All these activities, sacrifice, charity, and renunciation, should certainly be performed, but without attachment to, or without any desire to enjoy the results of the action. Krishna said it was his ultimate opinion then. He's reiterating that it's his opinion now. So this is where Krishna wants Arjuna to be, engaged in prescribed actions without attachment to the action itself, without a desire to gain something, simply because this is what he's supposed to do. Do your duty for the sake of doing your duty. You do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get anything out of it. And there's a bit of a paradox here, because materially, Arjuna is not going to get anything out of it. Every bad thing that he thinks is going to happen is going to happen. So in that sense, everything's bad, nothing is good about this situation. However, there is a higher level of benefit to Arjuna from moving through this rather than trying to run away from it, which is the benefit of renunciation, as I discussed earlier, liberation from the entanglement of material life and elevation, or to the transformation of material consciousness to spiritual consciousness. We transcend the world by moving through the world, and in so doing, we become invincible. We experience our eternal spiritual nature, and the problems of the material world roll off us like water off a duck's back. The problems are all still there, but one of the functions of yoga is to place our consciousness in such a way, in such a position, so that our happiness is not dependent on external conditions that we have very limited, if any, control over. Which brings us to the next verse, the symptoms of the kind of renunciation that Krishna is speaking of. So text 10, once again, the intelligent renunciate, whose doubts have been severed, who is situated in the mode of goodness, has neither an aversion to disagreeable actions nor any attachment to action that is agreeable. So here we find the two of the 5 obstacles to yoga that Patanjali speaks about in his Yoga Sutras: attachment and aversion, in the opposite order. First, the aversion is to disagreeable actions. Who wants to do the stuff we don't want to do? Nobody. We have an aversion to doing things we don't want to do. When we're a little kid, if we're not really into school, we don't have an aversion to going to school. When we want to go out and play, we have an aversion to doing our homework. When our parents impose any number of austerities on us that we have no control over because we are subordinate to our parents, we have an aversion to these disagreeable actions. However, we do have an attachment to actions that are agreeable, like going out and playing and stuff like that. At least I used to go out and play when I was a kid. I hope kids still just go out and play. It's healthy. Anyway, this is what is meant by renunciation of the action itself. That is to say, you don't renounce the action itself, you renounce your attachment to this action or that action, your aversion to this action or that action. Whether the action is pleasurable or unpleasurable, if it has to be done, then you do it. And you cultivate that kind of state of mind, state of being, where you're not bummed out by the disagreeable actions and you're not elated by the agreeable actions. And Krishna had spoken about this state of not being elated when it's going great and not being bummed when it's going badly in earlier verses. In one of those earlier verses, the phrase raga dvesha, attachments and aversions, is used. This is in 264, chapter 2, 64th verse. But those who remain free from attractions and aversions, or attachments and aversions, exercising self-control, even as the senses engage with their objects, attains the grace of the Lord. So I said earlier that one of the benefits of this kind of renunciation is grace. Remember back in the 10th chapter how Krishna described that the particular benefit of being his devotee is that he illuminates the path to him for those who are devoted to him. He dispels the darkness of ignorance with the shining lamp of knowledge from within. So one whose doubts have been severed, he speaks earlier about how Arjuna's doubts should be severed with the sword of knowledge, and therefore he should rise and fight. Therefore, exercising self-control, not being elated or bummed when the senses engage with their objects, which is to say Arjuna now has to use his senses to engage in this battle. His intelligence to figure out how to defeat his enemy, his sense of sight in aiming his bow and arrow, his sense of hearing and knowing what's going on around him, et cetera, et cetera. So there are few things that are more disagreeable than warfare. And when you're in a life and death situation, your senses are on high alert. You're very, very focused. If you have trouble keeping your mind focused in your meditation practice, think of it as a matter of life and death. Because it is. If you want to become free from death, perfect your meditation practice and then keep your meditation practice going while you're engaged in activities. But try that. If you sit down for, a formal meditation practice and your mind wanders off, think of it as this is a life and death situation. Because if your life's in danger, you bring your senses just are super jacked up. Your amp goes up to 11. And you pay very close attention to everything without deviating your attention in any way whatsoever. So practice meditation like it's a life or death situation, because there's no way to delay that trouble coming every day. And the biggest trouble is time will eventually run out on all of us. Which brings us to the 11th verse for this evening. To abstain from action entirely is indisputably impossible for one who is embodied. One who renounces the fruits of action, however, is said to be a genuine renunciate. So here Krishna speaks of the impossibility of inactivity. Back in the 3rd chapter, he spoke about this when he said, freedom from actions, reactions is not obtained merely by abstaining from action, nor can perfection be achieved, by renunciation alone. So you can't just walk away from action and think that you're going to short circuit your karma, because you're not. Your karma will still be there. In the next verse, he says, in fact, no one remains inactive, even for a moment. Know for certain that everyone is forced to act, even unwillingly, by the qualities of material nature that hold sway over them. So even if you don't want to act, the qualities of material nature that influence us to be a particular way will force us to act a particular way. And the idea that you can cease acting, this is something Krishna dismisses as, nope, not going to happen. Not just because the modes of material nature are acting on us, but another thing to consider is that as a spiritual person, spiritual life is dynamic. It's not just the absence of material life. It's not just negation of everything that we know in terms of the world of our experience, but rather, because that would be boring, and who would want to do that? Liberation is the starting point to the dynamic activity of spiritual life in relationship to the Supreme Person, and in relationship to all those who are also engaged in that same relationship. The Supreme Person, Krishna, becomes the focal point through which all of our other dynamic spiritual relationships flow. If you have any questions about that, here's your big chance, because I'm going to take a drink of water. Later on in the 4th chapter, Krishna speaks about this again. Free from the desire to enjoy the fruits of actions, the mind and senses controlled by spiritual intelligence, having relinquished all sense of proprietorship over one's possessions and acting only as needed to maintain the basic necessities of life, one's body, one remains free from sinful reactions. So, this is another benefit of renunciation. Freedom from bad karma. Sue, thank you for your question or comment. Goodness is a launch pad to transcendence. Do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, that takes us to the platform that now gives us a jumping off point from the highest quality of material nature, one can, or sattva, one can jump from there to shuddha sattva, or pure goodness, spiritual consciousness. All right, my words are connecting with you. Well, all right. I've been talking enough, so I hope at least some of them have resonated with you, and it's good to know that I connected on at least something. Carla, but it is so difficult not to be invested in the results of one's actions. Yes, it is simple, but it is not easy. So where do we get the strength to do this sort of thing? Well, it's not a matter of just the extinguishing of desire, but rather the purification of desire. We are very small, Krishna is very big, and he's promised to give us help. So when we take ourselves out of the center and put Krishna in the center and try our best to reorient our desires to align them with Krishna's desires and make ourselves an instrument of Krishna's will and a source of Krishna's enjoyment by virtue of engaging in a relationship of love with him, then Krishna supplies whatever strength we're missing. To those who are devoted to Krishna, he says early in the Gita, I sustain what they have and carry what they lack. So if you're feeling an absence of strength, you can turn to the source of unlimited strength, Krishna, and tap into the strength that he says in the Bhagavad Gita he will gladly give you in order to make up for whatever you lack. Which brings us to our last verse for the evening, which is the verse that we are going to chant. So this is verse number 12. A quick further explanation of diacritical marks, the pronunciation cues. A dot under an S is an SH sound. A dot under a T means that rather than sounding the T with your tongue right behind your teeth, you're going to pull your tongue back into the center of the roof of your mouth. Accent mark over an S indicates a deeper SH sound rather than a regular high-pitched white noise sh. It's further back in your throat and therefore a lower-pitched pink noise. A C is always a CH sound instead of a K sound or an S sound. We pronounce each letter that we see, so an H after a P would not be combined with the P to make a P, an F sound like phantasmagoria, but rather you just put some air after the P. This is true with any vowel, as in the next line after a B as well. And I think that covers it. So I'm going to chant each line. And if you like, you can chant each line back. Here we go. Nishtam ishtam nishram cha. trividham karmana phalam bhavatya tyaginam pretya nattu sanyasinam kvachit. The translation: even after death, the threefold fruits of action, desirable, undesirable, and mixed, come to those who are not renounced. For those who are renounced, there is no such result at any time. So this is good news for those of us who like justice, because that means nobody gets away with anything. Those who are attached to the fruits of their actions are obliged to experience the desirable, undesirable, or mixed results of their actions. And if they're evildoers, as they might be, then even though they may live to the end of their life seemingly having gotten away with their evil doings, nope, even after death, their evil doings will follow them into the next life. And then they will have difficulties in accordance with their evil doings, or if they were do-gooders, desirable results. If they had a little bit of both, then they get mixed results. Detachment from the kind of action one performs is in Sanskrit called Nishkama Karma Yoga. And it is this kind of karma yoga that is the topmost karma yoga that then, informed by transcendental knowledge, becomes bhakti. That is to say, resolves ultimately in bhakti. In the 4th chapter, we hear Krishna say, "O conqueror of riches," another name for Arjuna, as I spoke about before, "one who renounces the fruits of action in accordance with the principles of sacrifice, whose doubts have been severed by transcendental knowledge, and who has thus regained the composure of self-reflection, is not bound by reactions to actions. Therefore, O Bharat," indicating Arjuna's royal lineage, "you should slash the doubts that have arisen in your heart due to ignorance with the sword of knowledge. Armed with yoga, stand and fight." And that brings us to the end of our class for this evening. We spoke about how karma and renunciation are intimately related, and how renunciation is a key to the execution of the highest level of karma yoga, which ultimately leads to liberation from karma altogether. We spoke about the impossibility of inactivity and how there's no way to delay that trouble coming every day. We covered verses 7 through 12. So, last call for questions or comments. Please pop any questions or comments you may have into the chat window or the Q&A box if you prefer. If you are watching after the fact and would like to send a question or comment to me, I would be delighted to hear from you. My email address is hari@hari-kirtana.com. So please keep your cards and letters coming in. Next week, we continue with chapter 18, the Yoga of Perfect Renunciation. We will hear Krishna speak about the 5 factors of action. We'll see how egoism is for demonic donkeys. That's right. Egoism is for demonic donkeys. And we will discuss the ethics of yoga as we hear Krishna give Arjuna a license to kill. We'll cover verses 13 through 17. All right. Last call. Any questions, any comments? Jill, you're very welcome. My pleasure. Always a welcome comment. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful evening or wonderful day or wonderful afternoon, whatever it is you're likely to be having whenever you are watching this. Carla, thank you very much. Have a good evening. I hope to see you all again next week. And until then, I wish you all well. Have a nice night.